Greetings, everybody. This is for my U.S. History 2 students. We're still discussing the return to normalcy. Concept 3, looking at how the Republican domestic program from 1921 to 1933 would lead to the Great Depression. So, I have the factors listed there. Basically, the factors between these years: unequal distribution of wealth, mental attitude of the general public, overproduction, the external tax policy, Andrew Mellon's Revenue Acts, the holding companies, and the banking structure are all going to lead towards the Great Depression. So the significance of the Republican domestic program from 1921 to 1933 was that it helped create and or stimulate weakened conditions in the economy which were responsible for the crash and depression in 1929. There seems to be little question that in 1929 the economy was fundamentally unsound. Many things were wrong. But 7 weaknesses seem to have an especially intimate bearing on the ensuing disaster, the collapse of the economy. So first, unequal distribution of wealth. In 1929, the 5% of the population with the highest income received approximately a third of all personal income. Thus, the lower classes had no purchasing power, while the upper classes engaged in a high level of luxury consumption, capital investment, and speculation. So this is the idea of the Roaring Twenties, right? So the people that you see in old footage of people partying and dressing in the latest fashions and driving automobiles. This was a very small part of the population in the 1920s. The mental attitude of the general public and the way they perceived the economy was also really important. Overly positive and overly negative mental attitudes played important roles, respectively, first in creating the Depression and in prolonging it. As a result of the artificial profits that were made because of the Republican domestic program, the American public was overconfident in the economy. This led to a great deal of unsound economic practices. A larger public than ever before had the money and the leisure to participate in affluent society. A new and growing advertising industry used the psychology that all the new products society manufactured were basic necessities to life. This created a desire to buy. By the 1920s, advertising had grown into both a major industry and a major institution of social control. One-time values of thrift and saving gave way to new economic ethics which made spending a virtue. Sound familiar? The innovation of installment buying made increased consumption feasible for many. Psychology played an important role in advertising. Since few of the new products could be considered basic necessities, ads had to create a desire to buy. Advertisers often used the implied approval of science, represented by white-coated doctors who appeared in many advertisements to sell their products. Ad writers also sold products by calling attention to people's insecurities. They came up with a variety of socially unacceptable diseases, including sneaker smell, ashtray breath, and the dreaded BO, body odor. Right? These were all new phenomena that people were being told that they had to take care of by buying certain products. They're called creative wants in marketing. Uneven distribution of wealth is another factor. However, it limited the adoption of these new patterns of consumption to the more prosperous members of middle class. A yearly income of about 65% of American families was less than $2,000 at the height of the prosperity in the 1920s. So about $2,000 in the 1920s would be the equivalent of $15,000 to maybe $20,000 in today's money. The average family income for the bottom 40% of the population was even smaller, maybe $725. With the amount a family spent an average of a mere $290 a year for food, $109 for housing, $110 for clothing. These expenditures left only $135 for anything else. The problem of uneven distribution was partially overcome by a dramatic increase in installment buying, credit. With easier credit and buying on time, families could spend on the basis of the future as well as current income. It is difficult to realize how revolutionary the philosophy of buy now, pay later was to customers back then, since it's an everyday part of life now, but this truly was a revolutionary time. With the prospect of good times ahead, consumers abandoned old-time values of thrift and saving to turn to their new economic ethic. This ethic made spending a virtue and used all economic flexibility of the average consumer. When the Depression came, the consumer in the economy had no economic flexibility to fall back on, only debt to fall back on. After the economy collapsed, the confidence and willingness of both business and the consumer to participate in the economy was completely destroyed. Consequently, an overly negative attitude developed, which prolonged the Great Depression, the ensuing Great Depression. Another problem, overproduction, created as a result of the Republican domestic program, was a direct result of excess profits made by big business and was a major contributor to the causes of the Depression. As discussed, the external tax policy created an unhealthy balance in foreign trade. So the tariff policies, in other words. Another weakness was the poor state of economic intelligence. The economic philosophy of Hoover and the Republican presidents of the 1920s, as well as a huge section of the Democratic Party, greatly inhibited Hoover's attacks on the Depression and caused the economy to reach its unstable state during the 1920s. This point was demonstrated with Andrew Mellon's Revenue Acts of the 1920s and the trickle-down theory which supported these acts. Another area where a misplaced economic philosophy appeared was in dealing with the American tariff system and the idea that a high tariff was good for the total economy. Finally, when the Depression came, the government asked how to advance recovery. The answer from the economic advisors was the budget should be balanced. Both parties, Democrats and Republicans, agreed with this. This policy meant that there could be no increase in government outlays to expand purchasing power and relieve distress. It also meant there would be no further tax reduction to give to the common person for relief and for more purchasing power. Instead of stimulating the economy, this action stagnated the economy. The attempts to balance the budget limited efforts to make interest rates low and credit plentiful. Another effect of the Republican domestic program was that it fostered large-scale corporate combinations, which led to an unstable corporate structure. The holding company was the most common device for concentrating economic control. Of the 100 biggest industrial corporations in 1929, 94 were holding companies. 21 were purely holding companies that did not themselves produce anything. Holding companies were formed to obtain control over a large number of other companies with little investment as possible. The holding company pyramids would last only as long as earnings of the companies at the bottom were secure, because upstream companies had issued stock and bonds on downstream companies. So company had 51%, by the end of the 1920s, companies 6 to 8 layers high were commonplace. So basically, I mean, these were fantasy companies used to garner stock investments from unsuspecting stock investors. There was a problem with this type of corporate structure, obviously. if anything happened to the dividends of the downstream companies, upstream companies could be in trouble because they had issued bonds on the stocks of the downstream companies. Once the earnings stopped, the bonds would go into default and the pyramid would collapse. Such a collapse would have a bad effect not only on the business and the investment by the operating companies, but also on the confident investment and the spending by the community at large. The final weakness was the unsound banking structure. Although the bankers and their policies were not unusually foolish in 1929, the banking structure was inherently weak. The weakness was implicit in the large number of independent units. When one bank failed, this led to other failures. These failures spread with a domino effect as the independent banks were hit with runs triggered by the collapse of another independent bank. So people, if they saw one bank down the street was going out of business, they would go to their bank and demand their money back. A run on the bank, in other words. Thus, the weak destroyed not only the weak bank, but also weakened the strong banks in turn. Another important factor was that many banks were deeply committed to the holding company pyramids. This meant that when the pyramids collapsed, the banking system was threatened. When income, employment, and values fell as a result of the Depression, bank failures could quickly become endemic. They would spread quickly, in other words. In the first 6 months of 1929, 346 banks failed in various parts of the country with the aggregate deposits of nearly $115 million. When income, employment, and values fell as a result of the Depression, bank failures could quickly become widespread. This happened after this all began happening after 1929. In a final summary, it is the light of the above weakness of the economy that the stock market crash of the 30s must be seen. The collapse in securities value affected the wealthy and the well-to-do. In the world of 1929, this was a virtual group. These members disposed of large portions of consumer income, and they were the source of the lion's share of personal savings and investment. Anything that struck at the spending or investment of this group would have necessity have broad effects on expenditure and income, the economy at large. Precisely, such a blow was struck by the stock market crash. The stock market crash was also an exceptionally effective way of exploiting the weaknesses of the corporate structure. The subsequent collapse of these systems destroyed both the ability to borrow and the willingness to lend for investment. The crash was also effective in bringing to an end the foreign lending by which the internal accounts had been balanced. Finally, when the misfortune had struck, the attitude of the time kept anything from being done about it. This perhaps was the most disconcerting feature of it all, right? So people are still operating under the old system, and so the idea of providing direct relief to people, of creating tax structures that would benefit the poor, was not really part of the political discourse as late as 1929, 1930, 1931. This is going to change with the advent of Roosevelt's administration and the advent of the New Deal. Anyway, that's concept 3. We'll come in with concept 4 in the next segment, talking about Hoover's administration and the beginning of the Great Depression. Talk to you all guys later. Let me know if you have any questions.